All right. Well, today on the show, we're excited to have Bethany Hiser with us today. Bethany, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you, Bethany. You just released a new book, From Burned Out to Beloved, and in that book, you share your story. And I would love to hear a little bit, maybe about the Bethany before you hit burnout. What motivated you? What was going on the inside of you, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so there's quite a few years before burnout. For me, one of the things that I could mention is that in college I studied peace studies and religion, and I remember praying that God would break my heart with the things that break God's heart. And I took classes on everything from Prejudice Across America to the history of the Middle East. And I wept and I wept and I wept as I learned about injustices and my own privilege. And I remember taking a class called on ethics and about the theory of doing good. And I remember leaving, being sick of talking about the theories and just wanting to do good. So I left college with a heart to make a difference. And I wasn't sure exactly how, but a number of years later, I started my master's in social work. And one of the things they talk about in social work is micro, meso, and macro. So working directly with people, micro, meso, more groups, and then macro. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I wanted to do it all in some ways. And so I actually ended up doing it all in various different capacities. And I was very motivated. You asked what I was motivated by, and I was motivated to make a difference. I was motivated because I cared, because I felt grief at the realities that I was experiencing and witnessing. I was motivated because I felt like God was calling me to do something about it and to be engaged. And so I wanted to change systems, and I wanted to help people, and I wanted to increase awareness about, particularly for me, it was immigration challenges, as well as incarceration and domestic violence, and also trafficking of people. So violence against women. And so I actually became involved on all those levels with people facing those realities. So I was organizing 2 coalitions around trafficking. I was working in a family support center. I was working in a domestic violence shelter, and I was studying for my MSW, as well as working at another organization, a ministry. So I was very busy. Mm-hmm. And I was working long hours without taking breaks. I kept pushing through things, and partly because of the demand of the work, and partly because I was also a student, and partly just because I was very driven and I wanted to make a difference. And then I became increasingly unaware of how things were impacting me, and it just felt easier. And I knew that I wanted to, there's so many things to do. So I became increasingly emotionally exhausted and burdened by the stories that I was hearing. And yet, instead of processing them, Mark, I kept going, and I wasn't aware of how I was being impacted.
Yeah. So there's nothing wrong with obviously caring, wanting to make a difference. But what was it about those things? And you had a lot going on. What was it about those things that led to burnout?
Yeah, I think partly it was my own personal disconnect of how I was being impacted. So one of the things that really opened my eyes was a class called Self-Care for Social Workers that my friend encouraged me to take. And I thought, self-care, it's just going to tell me to eat better and sleep better and get exercise. And I was like, I already got that, I'm fine. So I was really out of touch with how I was being impacted. And the class was actually by Laura Vandernoot Lipsky, who wrote the book Trauma Stewardship. Not sure if you're familiar with that, but it really opened my eyes to connect the dots for me of how I was being impacted. And I hadn't put things together. So it kind of helped me dig a little deeper, and in some ways catalyzed the journey that I've been on. So I started realizing I wasn't okay. And we actually had a work retreat a number of months after that class. And I thought, oh, I'm more aware, I'm doing better, I've made some small changes. And yet that retreat, we talked about self-care again, and I realized I'm not doing okay. So I think in terms of what was changing was starting to realize that I wasn't handling things as well, that I was increasingly, emotionally exhausted, which later I realized is one of the signs of burnout.
Yeah. You use that phrase a couple of times that you didn't realize how those things were impacting you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of times we just double down. We just continue to press forward. We just continue to go. Can you talk about what does that disconnect do to us when we feel something is off on the inside, but let's press forward. There are people to make a difference for. There's things to get done. What is the disconnect? What happens inside of us when we don't? Something is going on. We just ignore it and we just continue to go.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole series of things that we could talk about with that that happen to us. I mean, I think physiologically, when we're not listening to our body's needs, the stress can build up and build up and build up, and it can lead to serious ramifications. I mean, there's more and more studies about how stress impacts our bodies. So I was grinding my teeth, for example, and I had to get a root canal because my stress was impacting my own, my physical well-being in that way. And so I think if we're not aware, that's one way. I think also just in terms of the toll of hearing stories, I wasn't aware of the lens that it was creating for me, of how I was seeing the world. Laura, the author, actually she opens her book by talking about being on vacation and looking out over this beautiful, pristine vista on vacation, but standing on a cliff and alongside of her family members, and everyone's admiring the view. And she had been a social worker at a crisis hospital for a number of years, and she realized what was on her mind was, I wonder how many people have committed suicide by jumping off this cliff. And that was just a normal thought. She thought everyone else who was standing there was probably thinking the same thing. She had no idea that was probably a trauma exposure response. And she mentioned it. All of a sudden it came out of her mouth, and everyone looked at her and said, are you sure this work isn't affecting you? So for her, that actually helped catalyze her own journey of realizing, oh, my lens is shifted. And so I think for me too, working with survivors of domestic violence and trafficking, it was affecting my view of my own safety, of relationships, of people, and yet I wasn't aware of that lens that it was creating for me. How does that answer?
Yeah. Can you talk about that lens that you weren't aware how it was affecting you? You weren't aware of the lens that it was creating. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things too is that it was affecting my, this isn't exactly in terms of the lens, but just my own needs that I was trying to meet through my work. So it's an additional way that we're impacted, that we're, I was thinking that I was being helpful. And yet sometimes I was being helpful to meet my own need for impact and for success and for approval. And I think that's in some ways a little different than the secondary trauma lens, but that's a lens that was affecting my burnout. In terms of secondary trauma, I think the expectation, the reality that of hearing so many stories of abuse and of violence, that it made that more normal. And it made my expectations for myself, oh, I'm doing fine. Who am I? I think that this is one of the bigger ways, is who am I to need help and to need care and to receive when I've got so much. I shouldn't ask for help. I shouldn't slow down. I shouldn't take a break, because look at all that I have, all the support I have, and I have a job and I have this and this. And so when I would compare it to the stories of people that I was accompanying, then I would feel guilty at taking any time for myself, that I didn't deserve that.
Yeah. And so what was that moment like when you realized that you were burned out? And maybe it wasn't a moment, maybe it was over a course of time, but what was that like when you realized, oh my goodness, I'm burned out? What was that like?
Yeah, I took an emergency week off. So it definitely was building. There was different pieces of it. It wasn't totally a moment, but there was a moment that I remember driving to my parents have a small cabin, and I was driving to the cabin an hour away from where I was working and living at the time, and I just couldn't stop the tears. And I had actually had a really difficult conversation in the domestic violence agency with one of the women who had come in, and I talk about this in the book, that she was in tears, and she asked, why do men do this to women? And I have been grappling with that reality of violence myself, and victimization, and so I just started crying as well. And usually I was able to kind of hold the space for the other person. Not to say that tears don't have a place, but I was able to hold space for the other person to grieve and to be present with them in their grief. And I just felt like I wasn't able to do that in the same way. And so I think that both of those moments for me of realizing I'm not able to be present to somebody else in their suffering right now. And I'm not even sure. I wasn't even sure what was happening to me. I was just absolutely exhausted and done and overwhelmed.
Yeah. I wonder if something that would be helpful for people that might be watching or listening is if you could describe what is burnout.
Yeah, so I'm talking about secondary trauma, but burnout doesn't necessarily have to involve secondary trauma. The Maslach, who Christine Maslach wrote, was kind of one of the earlier definers of burnout. And she talks about emotional exhaustion, which is what I was just talking about as one of the keys of burnout. And she says it's a psychological syndrome. So it's something that affects our mental well-being. The second one she talks about is depersonalization. So having a view of other people that they're not as objects, or they're not as human, that we're a compassionate response towards people. And then also a diminished sense of accomplishment. So a feeling like you're not making any difference. There's nothing you can do about this reality. So those things can happen in a variety of settings. Right now in this global pandemic, the people that are working in hospitals, they might be very well could be experiencing secondary trauma, meaning the toll of hearing people's stories, not necessarily experiencing trauma to themselves, but witnessing trauma is what we talk about with secondary trauma. But they could be experiencing that, but they could also just be experiencing utter increase of demand in their work and limited capacity to provide it. So that can lead to burnout, even if there's so that could be at a school setting, it could be at a business, it could be a variety of different settings, and when there's increased demand and expectation without the internal resources or the support to provide the work that you're needing, can lead to burnout.
Yeah. And that is one of the things that I really loved about your book is you talk about, and you've referenced it several times, secondary trauma. Could you explain what is secondary trauma?
Yeah, so as I just mentioned, it's the secondary exposure. So sometimes it's talked about vicarious trauma. So if I were to be the victim, of violence, that would be primary trauma. When I hear a story about someone else experiencing violence, that's secondary trauma. The build up over time, usually, of hearing stories, it does not necessarily, just hearing a story once doesn't mean you've experienced secondary trauma, but usually the repeated exposure of hearing so as Laura Vander Lipsky uses trauma exposure response, is that the more stories you hear, the more it impacts you and the kind of being burdened by those realities. So some of the symptoms can include the feeling of helplessness, hopelessness, a sense that you can never do enough, guilt, what I mentioned earlier. But that it can really be similar to PTSD in some ways, post-traumatic stress disorder. So it can lead to sleeplessness and a hypervigilance, so an inability to slow down, as well as the disconnect from what's going on in us, as I was mentioning for myself. It also leads to diminished creativity, and just kind of a black and white thinking, an inability to embrace complexity. So there's a variety of different, she talks about the 16 most common responses to secondary trauma, which was what was really helpful for me.
Yeah, because in your book, you say that secondary trauma is a byproduct of the helping profession. And I just started to think of all of the helping professions.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially when in a global pandemic right now, the increase, I mean, there's a communal aspect, but there's also an isolation that's happening in terms of people experiencing secondary trauma, I would imagine, in various different settings, and also less resources, less capacity, and more disconnect. So I think that can increase for me, that to know that part of understanding secondary trauma is realizing, oh, I'm not alone. This is a normal response to what I'm experiencing. And so workplaces can help improve that understanding and awareness and support of people. And yet when people are more isolated and distanced right now, and there's less interaction and support, then I am concerned that that's even harder to achieve in different settings.
Yeah. And so these helping professions, because so many times we talk about burnout as, I got burned out because I was too busy. I was doing too much. And I really don't think I've ever thought about burnout in terms of I've interacted with so many people and their trauma and the way that impacts me, that I'm taking that on, and just what that's doing to me on the inside. That just changes the way that we think about burnout, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And it changes the way we need to respond to it. Is that right?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I mean, because self-care then if we just think about a change of pace of life, which is part of it, then we think it's just more things to do or to change our habits. So that's when the advice of eat well and exercise and sleep, slow down, I mean, those are all good things. And yet, unless we address the inner reality, then we'll have a harder time really changing our own behavior. So unless we address our false beliefs and the things that are driving us, we're going to channel our workaholism in different settings, even if we're trying to change our pace of life. And that's not really going to make a difference if we just slow down. Because those stories, I mean, part of what, I think of crisis responders who go from crisis to crisis internationally, it's just easier to go from one place to a next and to keep going than stopping and listening to processing the stories and the realities. I mean, I've heard of that from various different people who are in groups who literally their job is to respond to international crisis. The amount of energy it takes to slow down and to process stories can be really overwhelming.
One of the things you referenced a moment ago is you talked about how organizations can help us to process these stories. In your book, you actually talk about how burnout can be added on to, I guess, by the organizational culture that we're a part of. How can organizational culture also add on to this?
Yeah. Well, so I mentioned pace and pressure. I would also think of expectations that are on individual workers, as well as I've worked in a variety of different social service settings, and when we work as though we are there to help, and yet we don't have needs ourselves. And then I feel like that contributes to burnout. We're disconnected from ourselves as humans and the ways that we're impacted. And we act as though we are just there to help other people.
Mm.
And that increases our own disconnect from what's going on in ourselves. And one of the things that I started realizing was at the domestic violence shelter, hey, we're not talking about how this work is affecting us. We meet together, we talk about what's going on with the clients and what we can do, and we keep going. And yet we're all really hearing these terrible stories about things that are happening, and we're not acknowledging, hey, this is heavy, this is hard. We're acting in some ways as though we're robots and we need to just keep going and help people, instead of turning and saying, hey, how are you doing with that? That person this situation just happened. And I mean, I still remember some stories from women that would come in, and yeah, I felt like it would be weak or like something was wrong with me if I were to say, hey, I'm really impacted right now. Like, that was really a heavy time. I led support groups, and so I'd gather 8 to 15 women, and they'd all start talking and sharing some of the realities. And I'd at that setting at that time, it felt like everyone else was just handling it fine. And if I were to say, like, hey, I'm not doing well, or this is really intense, it didn't seem like there was space for that. And so I think when organizations create, whether it's structures or just in supervisory relationships, there's time for checking in and saying, hey, how are you doing right now with what's going on and what's going on for you? Instead of just focused on the work, that really can create a different trajectory and a different culture.
Yeah, I love that idea of creating spaces in organizations where you can share those kind of stories. Is that something that you do in your experience? Is that a weekly, happens in, say, a weekly meeting or conversation? What are some examples of what that can look like in an organization to intentionally create those kind of spaces?
Yeah, I mean, the ministry that I was working at for a number of years, and ended up inviting a spiritual director to come and meet with staff as a part of their work time for free once a month. And that really made a difference for me. And that was, it was a private, confidential conversation and just a chance for an outside person to hear and to walk with us and to hear how we were doing. I think also in supervision, a supervisor can provide that of, okay, and that my supervisor at the time was of checking in and saying, I'm not at the time of burnout, but this is later. But just saying, how are you doing? What's going on for you? How is this affecting you? I think also retreats, I think days off. I talked to International Justice Mission, someone who works there a couple months ago, and as a part of their rhythm, every morning at 8 a.m., they encourage all their staff to have a half hour of quiet. I think they call it, quiet. And that's part of their workday, is a half hour of your own quiet reflection prayer time. And then together as a staff, they have a half hour at 11. Everyone stops at 11 and they pray for the work of IJM. And that's around the whole world in the various time zones, of course. And so that's organizationally encouraged self-care, soul care, check-in time of saying, hey, we're not, one of the person I talked to said, 11 o'clock is kind of prime time. It's before lunch. It's time when you think you can be most productive, get some stuff done. And that's the time when they say, we're going to stop and we're going to meet together and check in and pray for each other and the work that we're doing. So that's another example. I think also, this is a harder one to address, but becoming aware of what are the ways we talk about the work, the stories we share about success, about what we're doing. Are we talking about, I I'm so busy, I haven't stopped, I haven't taken a break. Like, is that encouraged? Is that kind of fueled by the conversation that is at hand? Or is it more encouraged to say, hey, how are, just checking in with each other and noticing these signs of burnout? And it's not saying the person who, takes the longest lunch breaks is the one who's taking the most care of themselves. Maybe they're actually completely checked out and they're not doing well. So I think it's not a matter just of what we do or don't do, but it's really the internal, place that we're in.
Wow. One of the things you talk about in the book is codependency. And you say that codependency is relationship addiction. I really like that definition. How can codependency lead to burnout?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this was kind of the other big piece that helped my own exposure or recognizing my own journey and the need that I was for healing and recovery that I was needing to pursue, was understanding my own codependency. And in terms of how it leads to burnout, I think there's the inability to let go, to stop, and to be okay, even if others aren't okay. It's also going above and beyond to help people and being unaware of when someone's ready or not. So it's wanting to help someone because you want to help them, because you want to feel better. You feel awful about their situation, and so you want to make a difference for them. And then that's not hearing where they're at, and it's not actually loving and listening to, how are you, or what do you need right now? Maybe they're completely not ready for whatever you want to offer them, but you want to offer it because you see it as it's going to make a difference. So I think, and I could, there's definitely various different situations that myself and the team I was working with, that with, I tell a couple stories in the book, but just seeing people in crisis and wanting to help them, and yet coming to solutions and encouraging them to take steps that they weren't ready to take. So were we doing that because we loved them? Sure, but we were also doing that because we wanted to fix their situation and they weren't ready for our solutions.
Wow. I feel like you're reading my mail here. So when I'm motivated to do something, because if I don't do it, I think that person might get mad at me, and I want that. Is that a form of codependency?
I think so, yeah.
Free therapy right there. Wow.
But actually, there's a codependency self-assessment, and I brought that into my work when I actually went back to the same job at the ministry a couple of years after my burnout and after my sabbatical, and I went back to support staff, and so I started doing trainings on trauma and secondary trauma and codependency. And so there's a very helpful codependency self-assessment that I would walk people through, and it's kind of eye-opening to say, oh, I didn't even think that was that I was codependent at all, and here I actually am in the work that I'm doing. Because we have to think of it as, a partner codependent relationship. We don't think about it in terms of our workplace.
Yeah, because so many times the motivation is, and we don't even realize it, that the motivation is, I want to help you because of how it will make me feel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's kind of nailing the core of what that internal belief system, that unless we take care of that, unless we do our own inner work, then we can make all the self-care kind of goals and plans that we want, and yet we're not going to change our behavior.
Yeah.
So.
And so a key piece of the inner work that you talk about is identity.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about identity a lot, and you talk about it a lot in your book. What do we mean by that? What do you mean when you talk about identity, and how can I know if my identity is in the wrong place?
Good question. Yeah, it's definitely, that is kind of definitely the core of my book, is identity, that we are already beloved ones. And if we can reorient our identity to know that we are loved, not for what we do, but for who we are, then we live, we breathe, we move, we work, we accompany, we encounter other people in a different way. So instead of seeking to gain somebody's approval, when someone asks us, hey, will you do this for me? I'm free. We're not tied in the same way. I'm free to say yes, I'm free to say no, I'm free to say maybe or later. So it impacts our work in dramatic ways. When I know that my self-worth is not dependent on how someone receives me or dependent on how successful I am, that I know that I already am loved. And so I think you asked how can we know when our identity is in the wrong place? I think if we have a hard time saying no, or worry, oh, is that person going to be disappointed if I say no? And just also what we were talking about earlier in terms of what are we motivated by? It makes sense for our motivations to be mixed. That's normal. It's healthy that we're humans and we have a need for impact. That's a normal thing. And yet if our need for impact is the primary motivator that goes above and beyond the other person's needs, and above and beyond and outside of my identity as a beloved one, then my identity is in the wrong place. If my identity is one who makes an impact, then I'm going to be driven to the brink.
Yeah. So what did it do for you? And I guess what does it continue to do for you to root your identity as being a beloved daughter of God? How does that lead to the path of health recovery? What does that continue to do in your life?
Yeah, so I mean, even if we take that word rooted and roots and think about, I'm even looking out at my window outside and seeing trees and think of roots going down deep into healthy soil. And they're able to hold up a tree if they're getting what they need, if they're getting soil or have healthy soil and water and sunshine. And no matter what's happening up above, they're able to stay strong and hold that tree up. And so I think when I am rooted in my identity as a beloved one, when I live out of that place, then it doesn't mean that I don't experience the same things, and I'm swayed by my need for approval or my need to help people. I might still encounter people's needs, and yet I'm able to return to answer and to be rooted, knowing that I'm loved, even if someone's mad at me, or even if I'm not making an impact. So you said, how did it change? I mean, I think I'm still definitely in that journey, and I think I always will be. But I believe I'm not shaken as dramatically, especially when I have a daily practice. I mean, this is something I still need, Mark, is every day, at least if I can have it, at least 5 to 10 minutes. I have 2 little kids. So if I can have 5 to 10 minutes of quiet, of rooting myself as a beloved one, then I approach those around me in a different way. I don't know. Yeah, I'm trying to think of other examples, but just knowing I respond with more patience, I respond with more gentleness, I respond with more thoughtfulness, more creativity. I mean, kind of going full circle back to trauma exposure and secondary trauma. If that impacts our ability to think or it makes us think more black and white, and the feeling that you can never do enough, when we're rooted in knowing that we're loved by God, regardless of what we do, then we surrender and we are open and we trust that God is at work outside of us and in and through us. And it kind of changes that sense that you can never do enough, or that there's always more to do. Sure, that's there. And yet I know that it doesn't affect my worth.
And so the fundamental identity that we need to receive is that we are the beloved sons and daughters of God, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And we talk about that as Christians believe that. And as pastors, this is core to our faith. And yet, do we really live out of that place?
Mm.
Do we really live knowing that we are beloved and letting it change our behavior, letting it change how we impact people or how we interact with people, knowing that no matter what, that letting it, that we are beloved and that God is, that is core to who we are. It's core to how we are invited to live in the world.
Yeah. Like you said, we talk about it. That is so hard to receive and so hard to believe. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we we know that? Oh, I've heard that before. I believe that.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think we have such a hard time receiving that and letting that go down deep into us?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, imagine it depends somewhat on the individual in terms of what their barriers are to receiving that, and variety of the beliefs that we have. And so some of that is rooted way back in our childhood of kind of what has impacted us and our worldview and those internal narratives that we talked about. And then some of it is obviously learned behavior as we've grown up, that we think that receiving, for one, we can think that receiving is weak, and that we shouldn't ask for help. I think it also can be culturally and societally encouraged, or the opposite is society encouraged, of saying, your worth isn't what you do. We always ask kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? And we say, introduce ourselves by what we do. And so there's, at least in American culture, so I think there's a lot of emphasis on what we do as our primary identity, instead of in other cultures, it's who are you related to? Who's your family? That's how you introduce somebody, saying this is so-and-so, this is they're the daughter or son of so-and-so. That's how you name people even. And in our culture, we're so rooted in our identity as what we do.
Yeah. One of the things that I love about your book is, and you even just mentioned it, how you're still in that process. You'll be on that journey for the rest of your life. I love how so you don't paint the picture that this is just some simple process, take a couple of days off and everything's okay, that sort of thing. It's an ongoing journey, but this led to some dramatic changes in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about what some of those were?
Sure. So, it's funny because you said take a couple of days off, and I think I did take that week off, and I thought, okay, I'm good now. I just took some rest. I got to jump back into it. And actually, we had a visiting pastor who was overhearing me tell my story at some point, I don't know, maybe it was a year later. And because I'd kept on going, I thought, okay, I just needed to make some changes. I'm going to keep going. He said, you only took a week off? I was laid flat for a year when I experienced burnout. And I thought, wow, okay, interesting. And it kind of made me think, oh, maybe actually it's okay. Some people have to take more time, and I better be aware and make sure that I'm still doing my internal work. And so I actually ended up, it also kind of gave me permission to say, hey, maybe I'm need more time off, that I shouldn't expect that just because I took 5 days off, I should be better now. Maybe I need to do some more radical changes. And so, even at that time, actually, I had quit my job at the domestic violence agency. And I was still working at the small ministry at Tierra Nueva, and thought I could keep going and keep making some small changes. So small changes such as not checking my phone right away in the morning, creating better habits of rest and learning to say no. So some of those things, and yet still I was realizing that I'm still not okay. And so I ended up taking a larger sabbatical to rest and to discern and to step back and to think of, can I actually do this work that I feel called to do? I also went to counseling and started meeting with a spiritual director. I took up an improv class. So I I started doing various different things that were just for fun, because I'd been so serious and so driven that I thought, hey, actually improv's about learning to play again and to respond and to people's offers. And so I gave myself permission to do things that were just for fun and for myself.
Yeah. You mentioned that you've got some practices that you do, daily practices, weekly, and those kind of things. Can you give us a glimpse into what those might be? What maybe a few of the daily practices that you do?
Yeah, centering prayer is one practice that
Okay.
I'm very familiar with centering prayer, but it's for someone who is likes to do and to be busy, to stop and to receive and to be present. I mean, we're invited to be still and know that God is God. And so for me, the act of completely stopping and turning to God and receiving, sometimes I do that actually just lying on my back on the floor with my feet up. My friend talks about the gift that is to have the blood flow back from our feet into our heart. And it's also helpful because my back is often hurting after carrying 2 girls around. But so if I can have 5 minutes or 10 minutes lying on the floor practicing centering prayer, that has been a real gift for me. I also have been trying to do the Ignatian examine in the evening, where you look back through your day and notice kind of significant feelings of the day, offer gratitude, and notice where you experience God, where you turn toward God, and where you also turned away, and then looking towards the next day. So that's been a practice that has been really life-giving for me as well.
Would you say that there is one of the practices that you've started, and you talk about more in the book, but is there maybe one practice that you, after you've adopted it, you just found this practice has made a significant difference in my life? All of them together, all of them are obviously helpful, but is there one that you thought this one has really been profound?
I mean, I think journaling in some ways. I was journaling, but I'm hesitant to say that though, because I was journaling even in the midst of burnout and post burnout. And in that journey, writing has always been a therapeutic kind of processing way for me. And yet that when I just am processing, often it's a prayerful processing for me. So it's writing in conversation with God. And I think really is stopping and practicing centering prayer, I would say has been very profound for me, as well as prayerfully doing kind of imaginative Ignatian exercises where interacting with Jesus and talking to Jesus through imaginative listening prayer exercises have also been very eye-opening, a way that I get to connect to God and hear from God how beloved I am, and not just hear in my head, but really experience in my whole self. So you asked for one, and I just gave you 3. But
It's fine. That's fine.
Because I don't want anyone to come away saying, "Oh, I just need to do this,"
Yeah, that's right.
and then I'll be okay. Because I think sometimes that's been my bent is, oh, if I just do this, then I'll fix myself. And so it's not that. I think really needing to respond to your own uniqueness and to what works for an individual in their own season of life, as well as for their personality, figuring out what is your invitation right now, and not just thinking that this is the solution, that you just have to do it and then you'll be better. We like that. We like 1, 2, 3 steps. We like to say this is the answer. So for me, I think there's a goodness though, I would say, is committing to something and trying to hold on to it for a week, a month, and making it a daily practice. So that maybe that's the core, is no matter what it is to say, hey, I'm going to do this, something that is life-giving, that is grounding in your identity as a beloved one, and doing it every day.
Yeah. Bethany, what would you say to somebody that might be watching or listening and they think right now, you know what, I think that I'm burned out. I think that the way that you're talking is the way that I'm feeling.
Mm.
What would you say to them?
I'd say you're not alone,
Hmm.
for one, and you're not weak. I think sometimes people can think there's something wrong with them for experiencing burnout. For some reason, that's a common thread as well, is that we blame ourselves for burnout. We blame ourselves for being impacted by the work we're doing. And instead to say, this is having a toll on me and I need help. It's one of the first steps to recovery, is to say, hey, I need help. I'm not well. And so to say, you're not weak for needing help or being in need yourself. And then encouraging that person to ask for help. That's often a very hard thing for us in helping professions to do, is to say, hey, I'm not well and I need help. We like to be the helper. It feels more empowering, it feels good. And to instead put ourselves in the posture of receiving is a challenge, and it is yet also the path towards growth and change. So to that person, just offer you kindness and compassion for yourself, and to as though you would be speaking to a good friend, to say, hey, what do you need right now, and how can you pursue what would be life-giving for you in this moment.
Yeah. Well, Bethany, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. And we haven't even scratched the surface of everything that's in the book. And so I would just really encourage everybody watching, listening. You need to get the book. You need to dive into it. And one of the things that's helpful too, you talk about the practices, and then you talked about earlier false beliefs and things like that. At the end of every chapter, you've got questions and ways to begin to implement these things into our lives, and you point us to other resources. It's just helpful on so many levels. And so thank you for the book. Thank you for taking time to talk today. This has been great.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.
Now, before we started to record, you mentioned a website and a retreat that you're going to lead. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so my website is just my name, BethanyDearbornHiser.com, and I'm leading a retreat on January 3rd. It's just a 2-hour mini retreat and online, but it would be a chance for reflecting on this past year and then moving forward to this next year, using the Examine actually as a form of reflection. I'm leading a retreat for an organization this Monday, and I'm adapting the material and inviting other people to participate in it on January 3rd. So if you're listening and you're thinking, I could really use some guided time of reflection and prayerful contemplation, then this would be, love to have you join us.
Oh, that's great. And we'll link to that in our show notes, as well as to the book. Bethany, thanks so much for coming on today. This has been great.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me.